If you are listening to this right now, and you have ever been betrayed, manipulated, or discarded by your own flesh and blood, hit that like button immediately. Let me know down in the comments which city or country you are watching from, because what I am about to share with you is not just another family drama. It is a stark, brutal warning about the perils of blind paternal love, the venomous greed of entitled children, and the absolute necessity of establishing unshakable personal boundaries. While this is a dramatic fictional narrative designed to illustrate the dark consequences of greed and manipulation, the psychological scars and the legal mechanics of justice described here are as real and unyielding as the cold iron bars that kept me locked away for 2 entire years. I stood alone on the curb outside the prison perimeter fence, holding nothing at all. I had no duffel bag, no change of clothes, no personal keepsakes. Everything I had possessed before my arrest had been seized, sold, or locked away by the very people who framed me. I had nothing but the wet clothes on my back, a pair of worn leather dress shoes, and a volcanic fire churning in the pit of my stomach. That was when I noticed the camera lenses, 3 professional paparazzi photographers, heavily equipped with long telephoto lenses and weatherproof coverings, were crouched behind a concrete barrier 40 yards away. They were hired mercenaries, tipped off specifically for this exact hour and minute by my darling daughter-in-law, Tiffany St. Clair. They were not here to document a private family reunion. They were here to capture a highly manufactured corporate photo opportunity. The prodigal, forgiving CEO son welcoming his disgraced, rehabilitated father back into the fold. It was a calculated public relations stunt designed for the corporate newsletter and financial trade magazines, meant to calm jittery institutional investors and keep Ford Logistics stock prices stable amidst swirling market rumors. I did not nod, I did not smile, I did not blink my eyes or shift my weight by a millimeter. I remained as still and cold as a tombstone carved from black granite, staring right through his shoulder at the rain-streaked pavement. She thrust the cashmere-wrapped bundle right toward my chest, angling the child so that the photographers could capture the emotional instant of an aging grandfather touching his heir for the very first time. I lowered my gaze toward the blanket. The little boy was fast asleep, his chubby cheeks flushed pink, completely oblivious to the fact that his mother was exploiting his innocent little body as a human shield and a public relations prop in a psychological war against an old man. "What the hell do you think you are doing, old man?" Preston growled through gritted teeth, his nostrils flaring with unmasked rage. "Get into the back of the Bentley right now. We have a catered family brunch scheduled at the country club with 2 major investors, and you are going to sit at the head of the table and read the statement our legal team prepared for you. Do not dare embarrass me in front of these cameras." I stopped dead in my tracks. I turned my head slowly, allowing my gaze to drop to his pale fingers clamped around my damp gray sleeve. Then, I lifted my eyes and stared directly into the center of his pupils. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't clench my fists. I simply focused 60 years of accumulated grit, authority, and cold, calculating wrath into a single, piercing stare. The intensity of my gaze struck him like a physical blow across the windpipe. Preston gasped softly, his fingers instantly recoiling from my wool jacket, as if the fabric were glowing red-hot from a blacksmith's forge. He stumbled 2 steps backward into a puddle, his mouth working silently as the sheer, suffocating gravity of my presence overwhelmed his manufactured bravado. I watched his screaming figure shrink into the distance as Garrett shifted the sedan into drive and pulled away from the curb. Beside Preston, Tiffany was pulling desperately at his sleeve, trying to drag him back under the shelter of the Bentley, while covering her face with her handbag to shield her humiliation from the clicking camera shutters. I settled deep into the cracked leather seats, closed my tired eyes, and let out a long, steady breath that emptied 2 years of prison air from my lungs. "You look terrible, Harlan," Garrett muttered, his voice thick with genuine sorrow and fatigue. "The prison doctors told me you were refusing extra dietary supplements. You look like a man who walked out of a famine." "It is bad, Harlan," Garrett said softly, his tone dropping into a grim, professional cadence. "It is far worse than even our worst-case projections when your appeal was denied last autumn. That boy hasn't just been running your empire poorly, he has been actively butchering the beast and selling off its vital organs to fund his wife's lifestyle. That is where the real tragedy lies, Garrett said, his voice shaking with suppressed anger. Preston completely drained the liquid reserves of the Employee Retirement Trust Fund. He exploited a loophole in the corporate charter that allows temporary intercompany loans during periods of economic restructuring. He transferred over $8 million out of the drivers' and mechanics' pension fund directly into the primary logistics operating account, and then he burned right through it. To cover up the operational deficits, he sold off our entire southern regional long-haul trucking fleet. He outsourced 90% of our freight distribution in the southern corridor to a third-party, non-union logistics vendor. A cold, absolute calm settled directly over my heart. When anger reaches its absolute maximum density, it ceases to be hot and chaotic. It transforms into an icy, crystalline focus that can cut through reinforced steel. He is bleeding the company dry to feed her family of parasites, I murmured, turning to the next section of the ledger. What about our downtown corporate headquarters? The 42-story glass and steel tower on Fifth Avenue? Did he try to sell our primary fortress? There is something else, Harlan, Garrett said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Something far more dangerous than real estate liquidation. I discovered the paper trail only 72 hours ago through our internal contacts in the accounting department. 2 weeks ago, Preston got desperate. He secretly took $4 million of the company's remaining liquid payroll reserves and leveraged it on high-risk, speculative cryptocurrency margin calls, hoping to double the cash overnight before the quarterly board audit. So where did he go for emergency capital? I asked, leaning forward so my face was inches from Garrett's shoulder. No Tier 1 commercial bank in America would extend an unsecured bridge loan to a company with those balance sheets in 48 hours. I looked out the passenger window at the gray, rain-drenched skyscrapers of the city skyline across the river. And what did my son pledge as collateral to secure $12 million of high-risk offshore capital? I raised my right hand, palm facing forward, stopping his frantic legal strategy in its tracks. We will do no such thing, Garrett, I said softly, my voice calm and absolute. We will not file a single injunction. We will not challenge the validity of the loan note. And we certainly will not attempt to pay off 1 single cent of that principal. Garrett blinked rapidly, his brow furrowing in utter bewilderment. What? How on earth could I know that? It is an anonymous holding entity registered in the Cayman Islands under multiple layers of international shell registries and nominee directors. Our paralegals ran the corporate registry filings through 3 international databases. The true beneficial ownership is buried under impenetrable financial secrecy laws. It is completely impossible to trace who sits at the top of that pyramid. Garrett's jaw slowly began to drop, his knuckles relaxing their white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel. Arthur Keller, you had Arthur Keller working on something else? I am the apex predator, Garrett, I said, my voice dropping to a low lethal register. I am the offshore shark swimming in the deep water. When my son got desperate after gambling away our employees' payroll on cryptocurrency, I didn't let him sink right then. Instead, I handed him the exact length of financial rope he needed to fashion his own noose. He thinks he borrowed $12 million from a ruthless, anonymous cartel of international financiers. He believes he outsmarted the market and secured a corporate lifeline. He has no idea on this green earth that the shadow institution holding the mortgage on his mansion, the lien on his vehicles, and the absolute voting control of his corporate empire is controlled entirely by the very father he betrayed, framed and sent to rot in a concrete cage. Why on earth not? Garrett demanded, turning toward me. Why wait even 1 extra day? Why give that treacherous boy and his viper of a wife 1 more week residing in your family home, spending your money and pretending they own the city? Let's drop the guillotine right now and end this nightmare. I leaned forward, my reflection catching in the dark window glass beside my face. Because a fall from the 2nd-story balcony merely breaks your ankle, Garrett. But when you fall from the 42nd floor executive penthouse, when you fall from the absolute peak of your arrogance in front of every single person whose envy you desperately crave, that impact obliterates your entire identity. That is when we trigger the default clause. That is when I take back every single brick, every single dollar, and every single shred of dignity they stole from my life. To the hotel? Garrett asked, gesturing toward the downtown plaza. I booked you a quiet executive suite at the Four Seasons under my firm's corporate account, so you can rest and get some decent food. 10 minutes later, the massive, 12-foot-high wrought iron perimeter gates of Ford Manor loomed through the gray mist like the black, spiked teeth of a sleeping dragon. I had designed and commissioned those heavy iron gates 30 years ago, hiring master blacksmiths to forge them from reinforced steel, specifically to keep the chaotic, dangerous outside world at bay to protect my wife and my young son from any harm. But as Garrett brought the old Crown Victoria to a smooth halt right in front of the stone entry pillars, I stared up at the massive structure and realized with bitter irony that the fortress I had built was now actively shielding the true monsters inside from me. This is Garrett Hale, primary legal counsel for Harlan Ford. Garrett spoke clearly and forcefully into the rain-slicked microphone. I am sitting here with Mr. Harlan Ford himself. He has just arrived home from his incarceration. Open the main entrance gates immediately. I felt the tendon in my right jawline twitch once. Without saying a word to Garrett, I unlatched the rear passenger door and stepped right out into the freezing, driving rain. I pressed my thumb down harder against the glass, making sure the sensor captured every ridge of my print. Access denied, profile deleted. They were moving fast, winding rapidly up the steep curves of Old Hickory Lane, with their high-decibel horns blaring. Tiffany hadn't simply waited for us to ring the intercom pedestal. She had called the county emergency dispatch the exact second her security monitors detected Garrett's Crown Victoria turning off the main highway onto the private approach road. She had been sitting inside the warm, dry comfort of my living room, watching the high-definition security feeds like a venomous spider waiting at the center of its web, anticipating this precise confrontation so she could orchestrate my immediate return to a prison cell. I am completely unarmed, officer, I said clearly, my voice ringing out with an unshakable, icy calm that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic howling of the storm and the blaring police sirens around us. My name is Harlan Ford. I am standing at the primary entrance gate of my own residence. The massive oak front doors of the house swung wide open, and out stepped Tiffany onto the expansive, covered front portico. She was perfectly sheltered from the driving downpour by the 30-foot stone overhang, holding a steaming porcelain mug of coffee in one hand, while her red dress glowed against the gray stone background. She wasn't shedding theatrical tears or cuddling baby Leo for camera crews right now. She was pointing her manicured index finger directly down the long driveway toward my rain-soaked body, her features twisted into a mask of righteous, indignant victimhood for the benefit of the approaching police supervisors. Take the garbage down to the county jail right now, officers. Preston shouted down from his second-story perch, his voice slurring slightly from the early morning alcohol and adrenaline. You all know who he is. He is a violent, convicted assault perpetrator who has zero legal ownership or entry rights to this estate. The entire property title is registered in my name and my wife's name. He is trespassing on secured private land and terrorizing my family. Put the chains on him and lock him up where he belongs. Deputy, if you close that steel cuff around my client's wrist for even 1 second, you and every single supervisor in your precinct will be facing a multi-million-dollar federal civil rights lawsuit for wrongful arrest, false imprisonment, and unlawful enforcement of an illegal eviction before the sun goes down tonight. Garrett roared, his voice projecting with such absolute, unshakable legal certainty that the young deputy froze instantly, the steel ratchet hovering half-closed around my right wrist. I am Garrett Hale, senior managing partner at Hale, Vance & Associates, and I am primary legal counsel for Mr. Harlan Ford, standing right here, Garrett announced, marching straight up to the deputy until their chests were mere inches apart. And you are currently attempting to execute a felony arrest based on incomplete, fraudulent, and willfully misrepresented real estate records provided by that drunk sitting on the balcony up there. The deputy squinted through the rain pouring off his hat brim, his eyes tracking down the dense, formal legal typography across the page. His lips moved silently as he absorbed the legal wording. Then, his eyes widened slightly. He stopped reading, looked up at my face with sudden, sharp realization, looked back down at the document to verify the public seal, and then stared up at Preston standing on the balcony above. Garrett tapped his index finger hard against the parchment paper, punctuating every legal term. That covenant explicitly mandates that regardless of any subsequent transfer of title, regardless of who serves as executive trustee, regardless of any commercial sale, corporate liquidation, or familial dispute whatsoever, Mr. Harlan Ford retains the absolute, exclusive, and irrevocable legal right to reside in, occupy, and enjoy free and unencumbered access to the primary master suite and all common grounds of this real estate parcel for the entire duration of his natural human life. Preston's arrogant, sadistic smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a pasty gray pallor of absolute, suffocating terror. Both of his hands were clamped around the carved stone railing so tightly that his knuckles were bone white, his crystal tumbler forgotten on the ledge beside him. Down on the covered porch below, Tiffany had completely ceased her theatrical shrieking. She stood frozen right where she was, her coffee mug hovering halfway to her mouth, her eyes darting frantically back and forth between the legal binder in Garrett's hands and the police deputies who were now stepping actively away from my body. The young deputy looked at my face for 3 seconds, glanced down at the certified county deed in Garrett's binder one last time, and then reached out and unclipped the dangling steel handcuff from around my right wrist, slotting it neatly back into his utility belt. His expression wasn't angry. It was deeply annoyed, not at me or Garrett, but at the arrogant wealthy couple up on the hill who had just weaponized his badge and risked his career on a fraudulent 911 dispatch. The life estate covenant is legally binding under state real estate law, sir. The deputy shouted back through the bullhorn, resting his left hand firmly on his utility belt, right next to his tactical baton. If you do not disengage these electronic entrance gates within 30 seconds, I will personally instruct our tactical unit to cut through the iron chains with bolt cutters, and I will issue you a mandatory criminal citation for unlawful obstruction of a lawful residence easement and filing a false police report. Do not make me walk up that driveway and drag you out of that dressing gown, Mr. Ford. Open the gates immediately. I turned to the young deputy, offered him a slight, respectful nod of my head, and said, "Thank you for your professionalism and service today, officer. Stay warm out here." As I ascended the long, winding 300-yard approach toward the main house, I looked left and right at the grounds where I had spent 30 years of my life. The landscaping had been entirely butchered. My beloved, 30-year-old English rose gardens, the vibrant, fragrant beds of deep crimson and yellow roses that Beatrice had planted with her own hands when we first broke ground on the property, were completely gone. They had been dug up by root and replaced with sterile, razor-sharp geometric hedges of dark green boxwood and crushed white gravel that looked like the entrance to a corporate mausoleum or a psychiatric facility. The magnificent 3-tiered Italian marble water fountain in the center of the circular turnaround, where Preston used to float his toy wooden boats when he was 7 years old, was completely bone-dry. The basin was filled with rotting, rain-soaked autumn leaves, cigarette butts, and empty plastic water bottles. I walked up the wide stone steps of the portico, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I stopped precisely 3 feet right in front of her. For 30 years, those windows had been framed by soft, welcoming, gold brocade silk curtains that caught the afternoon sunlight and bathed the entire downstairs living space in a warm, golden, peaceful glow, a reflection of Beatrice's gentle soul. Now, those gold curtains had been ripped down and replaced by heavy, thick, light-blocking velvet draperies dyed a jarring, aggressive blood-red crimson. I didn't wait for her to formulate a reply. I stepped forward, my broad right shoulder brushing deliberately against her left bicep with just enough firm, physical momentum to force her to stumble 2 steps sideways in her high heels to clear my path across the threshold. I stepped firmly across the marble threshold, entering the interior of Ford Manor for the first time in 2 years. I smiled, and for the very first time on that dreadful, rainy Tuesday morning, it wasn't a cold, calculated smirk of tactical superiority. It was a broad, genuine, deeply satisfied smile that illuminated my entire face. The silence that enveloped the ground floor corridors of Ford Manor was not the peaceful, comforting quiet that I remembered from the 4 decades Beatrice and I had shared under this roof. It was a dense, suffocating silence, the oppressive, atmospheric stillness that hangs heavily across a valley just minutes before a violent tornado touches down and rips the trees from the earth. As Garrett Hale excused himself to drive back to his downtown legal offices to finalize the impending corporate default notices, I walked slowly down the primary central hallway of the house, my damp dress shoes leaving faint, dark impressions across the cold white marble floorboards. I stepped across the threshold, and my breath caught sharply in the back of my throat. My feet froze to the floorboards. I stood frozen in the center of the room, staring into the reflective glass at 12 identical images of myself. A gaunt, gray-haired 72-year-old man wearing a wet, baggy charcoal suit, staring with hollow eyes into the center of a nightmare. Where my button-tufted leather reading chair had once sat right beside the fireplace, there now stood a high-tech, commercial-grade running treadmill with a flashing digital monitor. Where my mahogany drafting table had rested, there was now a sprawling rack of iron dumbbells, kettlebells, and purple yoga mats on a rubberized floor covering. The stone fireplace, I moved faster down the hallway than I had moved in a decade, completely ignoring the dull, throbbing arthritic ache in my right knee. I bypassed the main dining room, rushed past the butler's pantry, and pushed through the swinging doors that led into the back utility wing of the mansion, the dark, labyrinthine service corridor that housed the laundry facilities, the primary boiler rooms, and the subterranean storage vaults. If those two entitled monsters had thrown 40 years of my life and Beatrice's memory into the trash, this deep, hidden service bowels of the estate was precisely where the debris would have landed before being hauled to the county landfill. I didn't spare a single second looking at the gold key or the crystal trophies. I fell right onto my knees on the wet concrete floor, my wool suit absorbing the freezing, dirty water, and began digging frantically through the towering pile of cardboard boxes and broken picture frames with my bare hands. I tossed aside framed photographs of ribbon-cutting ceremonies and leather-bound corporate charter volumes until my fingers scraped against the unmistakable, ornate contour of a wide, hand-gilded gold leaf frame wedged deep beneath 3 boxes of old winter coats. I sank all the way down onto my heels on the wet concrete, pulled Beatrice's portrait close against my chest, and bowed my head over the rotting frame. I remained kneeling on the concrete floor for 20 minutes. I pulled my clean cotton pocket handkerchief from the breast pocket of my suit jacket and meticulously, patiently, and with infinite gentleness wiped every spore of black mold and every trace of sewer grime off the surface of Beatrice's canvas and the remaining gilded frame. I smoothed out the torn corner of the fabric as best as I could with my thumb. They were not the polite, quiet steps of a domestic servant. They were heavy, dragging, arrogant footsteps that slapped carelessly against the marble floorboards. Preston sauntered into the middle of the salon, taking a casual sip of his scotch, while his bloodshot eyes scanned the space until they peeked around my shoulder and landed squarely on the gold frame resting on the console table. Preston reached into the back pocket of his designer jeans, pulled out a thick platinum money clip, and peeled off 5 crisp $100 bills from the top of the stack. He stood waiting in the center of the room, leaning slightly forward on the balls of his feet, his jaw jutting out with provocative defiance. He wanted me to explode. He wanted me to scream, curse his name, and lunge across the coffee table to throw those $500 bills right back into his face. He desperately needed me to initiate a violent physical confrontation right there in the salon so he could immediately summon the county sheriff's department back to the property, show them my aggressive behavior, and prove to the world that Harlan Ford was precisely the unstable, dangerous sociopath his legal team had painted in the courtroom. Preston blinked rapidly, his brow wrinkling in genuine, visible disappointment. The aggressive tension drained straight out of his posture. He had braced himself for a ferocious tiger leaping at his throat, and instead, he had just been handed the meek, subservient compliance of a broken, toothless old dog who had been thoroughly tamed by the prison yard. $500, I whispered to the empty room, looking directly at Beatrice's portrait. The exact price of my son's absolute arrogance. That cash will not buy me an off-the-rack shirt from a department store. Preston, That money will buy me a front row, VIP seat at your professional execution tonight. I slid my body underneath the dark overhang of the solid oak writing desk. I peeled the protective paper off the industrial-strength adhesive backing on the top of the transmitter, pressed the flat side firmly up against the unfinished, rough-hewn underside of the oak desktop, right in the deepest shadow near the central drawer cavity, and held it firmly in place with my thumb for 30 seconds until the adhesive bonded permanently with the timber. The $500 of his arrogance was safely tucked inside my pocket. The military-grade listening device was securely planted under his writing desk. The tactical game board was completely set inside the walls of Ford Manor. I was no longer an unwanted, helpless guest sitting in the attic of my own property. I was an active, lethal intelligence agent operating behind enemy lines inside my own fortress. And when the sun went down over the valley tonight, I would listen. My formal evening tuxedo, I walked back into the steam-filled bathroom and stood directly in front of the full-length mirror. The man staring right back at me through the glass was no longer inmate number 8940. He wasn't the gaunt, shivering, broken father who had stood pinned against the granite entry gate in the rain, while 4 sheriff's deputies snapped steel chains around his wrists. He was Harlan Ford, founder, absolute sole owner, and apex predator of the Ford logistics empire. Down below my feet, through the thick oak floorboards of the north wing, the entire ground floor of Ford Manor was vibrating with the unmistakable, opulent symphony of high society indulgence. I could hear the delicate, classical string arrangements of a live 4-piece chamber quartet tuning their cellos and violins inside the grand foyer. Rising up through the stairwell came the steady, aristocratic hum of 50 distinct, wealthy human voices conversing in polished, self-important murmurs, punctuated by the crystal clinking of champagne flutes and the crisp sound of silver serving trays circulating through the rooms. He had changed into a tailored, velvet-collared black tuxedo that fitted his thick frame tightly. He was holding a glass of expensive champagne high above his chest, throwing his head back and laughing far too loudly at some sycophantic joke delivered by one of his board members. His face was flushed a deep, unhealthy crimson from 3 hours of continuous afternoon drinking, but his posture radiated the manic, artificial confidence of a man who desperately believed he had successfully outsmarted the executioner. That diamond drop necklace had belonged to my mother. It was a priceless family heirloom that my father had bought in Paris in 1948, and I had placed it around Beatrice's neck on the night of our 35th wedding anniversary. When Beatrice passed away, I had placed that velvet jewelry box inside my master wall safe, leaving strict written instructions in our estate documents that it was never to be removed or worn until our true, legitimate grandchildren were old enough to inherit it. The polite, aristocratic conversation circulating across the foyer floor below didn't cease all at once. It died out in distinct, spreading waves, exactly like ripples expanding across the surface of a pond after a heavy stone is dropped right into the center. He hadn't prepared a single one of these elite financial vultures for the unexpected, imposing return of the true master of the house. Preston recovered his physical paralysis first. He shoved his champagne flute roughly into the hands of a passing waiter, detached his arm from Tiffany's grip, and marched straight across the white rug toward me, his face twisting into a tight, desperate, manufactured smile that didn't reach within 10 inches of his terrified eyes. Before I could formulate a verbal response or strip his fingers off my bicep, Tiffany stepped smoothly forward into the center of the circle. The universal polite code word for the horrific, fabricated lie that had sent me to cell block D for 730 days. Her sworn courtroom testimony that during a minor financial argument at the top of the stairs, I had flown into a violent rage and physically shoved her down 16 carpeted steps, causing internal blunt force trauma and the immediate miscarriage of her 14-week pregnancy. A baby boy they claimed they had already named Preston Ford Jr. She reached her right hand up and patted my wrinkled cheek twice with condescending, maternal pity. Then, I raised my right hand, covered her fingers resting against my cheek, and gently removed her hand from my face, lowering it down to her waist while keeping my grip light, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away. "That terrible night on the staircase 2 years ago," I said, dropping my voice an octave into a clear, penetrating inquiry. when you suffered your unfortunate fall and we tragically lost the baby. Tell me right now, Tiffany, was our unborn grandchild a boy or a girl? Tiffany darted her eyes rapidly toward Preston, panic flaring brightly in her pupils. Preston looked down at his patent leather loafers, his face flushing dark crimson as he cleared his throat nervously, completely unable to jump in and rescue her narrative. I reached my left hand directly into the inner silk breast pocket of my Roman tuxedo jacket. I bypassed the acoustic earpiece and pulled out a clean, crisp, 8 by 10-inch white piece of paper, folded neatly in thirds. I specifically requested those records because I wanted to privately fund a permanent, bronze memorial plaque at the hospital chapel to honor the memory of my lost grandson, I explained, looking right up over the edge of the paper into Tiffany's wide, terrified eyes. But according to the certified chief pathologist report, signed by the head of obstetrics on the exact night of your emergency admission, there is zero medical record or diagnostic mention of a male fetus anywhere in the clinical file. The physical color drained out of Tiffany's face, so fast and completely that her skin turned the chalky, translucent gray of skim milk. Her jaw dropped wide open, her chest heaving in shallow, hyperventilating gasps against the diamond drop necklace on her collarbone. She looked like a freshly exhumed corpse standing upright inside a designer red dress. Preston panicked completely. His entire corporate world was actively disintegrating in front of 50 of his primary capital lenders and social peers in real time. He looked frantically toward Tiffany, who was now shaking her head from side to side in paralyzed, mute denial, and then stared wildly around at the backing circle of bankers. Preston grabbed Tiffany roughly by her right wrist, yanking her physically away from my grasp with enough force to nearly drag her off her high heels on the rug. The wide circle of investment bankers, hedge fund managers, and city council members didn't close back in around me. Instead, the circle widened by 2 distinct feet, but they were no longer looking across the room at Harlan Ford with the patronizing, condescending pity reserved for a broken, senile old man who had lost his mind inside prison. I turned my back on the stunned circle of commercial bankers and walked smoothly across the foyer toward the buffet table in the grand dining room. I didn't need to turn my head or check my rear-view mirror to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that the lethal seeds of institutional doubt had been planted deep inside the fertile soil of the financial community. They were already sprouting strong roots. The massive Tudor mansion was completely dark and quiet now, but it wasn't resting at peace. It was holding its collective breath, vibrating with the suffocating, electrified tension of a powder keg waiting for a spark. Then, at exactly 2:15 in the morning, the heavy wooden door of the grand salon clicked open, and the receiver flooded with the sound of human voices. Then, Tiffany's voice cut straight through the electronic static of my earpiece. It was sharp, cold, brittle, and completely sober. She didn't sound hysterical or traumatized now that the bankers and cameras were gone. She sounded like a calculating, cornered syndicate boss evaluating her exit strategies. I sat forward on the edge of the mattress, pressing the earpiece tight against my ear. The conversation was shifting from historical cover-ups directly to the present capital hemorrhage. Then call the commercial business brokers in New York, first thing tomorrow morning, and sell off another corporate division. Tiffany commanded coldly, her tone devoid of the slightest sympathy for his corporate destruction. Sell off the entire Asian freight distribution network, or liquidate our European warehouse holdings. We had 3 open commercial acquisition offers on the table from foreign competitors last month. I need $50,000 in clean, unencumbered personal cash wired directly into my private Swiss checking account by 3 o'clock this Friday afternoon, Tiffany demanded. Her voice had completely shed the tone of a supportive, loving wife navigating a business crisis with her husband. It had adopted the cold, hard, extortionate ring of a professional blackmailer securing her severance package. Absolute silence filled my earpiece for 10 seconds. The threat was explicit, brutal, and absolute. She was weaponizing the child not as a beloved son or a family heir, but as an absolute, non-negotiable financial hostage to squeeze the last drop of blood out of my son's collapsing empire before she abandoned him to the wolves. I stood up from the edge of the mattress. The floorboards of the guest room felt solid beneath my boots. I had absorbed more than enough intelligence over the acoustic wire. It was time to stop sitting in the dark like a passive eavesdropper and start operating like the apex hunter I was born to be. I moved down the corridor with the silent, fluid grace of a phantom drifting through its own ancestral tomb. I reached the top landing of the secondary back staircase, the narrow, enclosed service steps that connected the upper guest wing directly down to the rear utility corridors and the east wing study, and began descending through the pitch-black stairwell without producing a single decibel of sound. Someone was moving around inside my study at 3 o'clock in the morning. She had stripped out of her designer crimson evening gown and changed into a pair of tight black running leggings and a dark silk tank top. Her spun-gold blonde hair was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian ponytail, and her face stripped of its heavy layers of evening foundation, and false eyelashes looked pale, sharp, and intense in the harsh reflection of her flashlight. A harsh, low-pitched error tone buzzed from the internal speaker. The small LD indicator screen on the faceplate flashed red. Error held access code 1985, her own birth year. A sharp, double-pitched alarm tone emitted from the keypad, and the digital display screen locked completely, glowing with a steady, bright red warning banner. System Massicat lockout. 3 LM. Entries detected keypad. For 5 minutes. That steel door is not going to open for you tonight. Tiffany, I said softly into the darkness. Who is that? Who is standing right there? Tiffany gasped out, scrambling backward across the rubber floor on her hands and knees until her spine hit the stone fireplace wall, right below the locked safe. Her chest was heaving wildly, her eyes wide with absolute, primal terror as she tried to peer into the shadows. Harlan, she breathed out, pressing both of her hands flat against her heaving chest as she pressed her back harder into the stone wall. Good God in heaven, you scared me half to death. What on earth are you doing, sneaking around inside the downstairs dark at 3 o'clock in the morning like a criminal? I was looking for my diamond stud earrings. Tiffany lied quickly, her words tripping over each other in frantic, desperate improvisation as her eyes darted wildly around the mirror-lined room looking for an exit. I was down here working out on the treadmill before our party started this afternoon, and I took my earrings off and set them down on the mantelpiece. When I came down just now to find them, I thought perhaps the housekeeping staff had placed them inside the wall, safe for safekeeping. She swallowed hard, her throat muscles working visibly under the flashlight beam as she stared up into my eyes. Tiffany's eyes went wide as saucers. The remaining color left in her lips vanished entirely, leaving her mouth pale and trembling. What on earth are you talking about? She whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the furnace. You were not hurt because my son argued with you, or because I pushed you down 16 carpeted steps inside this hallway that night. Tiffany, I murmured, leaning down so close that my shadow completely engulfed her face. You were bleeding internally and suffering from severe abdominal contusions because you suffered blunt force physical impact on the asphalt of Interstate 95 while riding on the back of your lover's motorcycle. And you knew with absolute mathematical certainty that if Preston ever discovered you had been reckless, if he discovered you were committing adultery with a gym trainer, the strict infidelity clause inside your prenuptial agreement would trigger instantly. You would have been thrown out of this mansion with 0 alimony, 0 property division, and 0 access to the Ford family fortune. Run along back upstairs to your bedroom right now, my dear. My voice floated out to her from the blackness right above her head. And when you get inside your room, lock your heavy oak door firmly behind you. Not to protect yourself from me, but because when my son eventually discovers the absolute, unforgivable extent of what you have done to his life, his money, and his father, he might be the one physical threat you desperately need to worry about. I raised my right index finger and calmly punched 4 specific numbers into the keypad. The digital display screen flashed a bright, vibrant green, and deep inside the steel cavity, the heavy, motorized, 1-inch chrome locking bolts retracted with a solid, mechanical clunk. At 7 o'clock the next morning, I walked right out the front doors of Ford Manor, bypassed my son's parked Bentley, and ordered a commercial taxicab to transport me directly down to the industrial south side of the city. I didn't instruct Garrett Hale to pick me up in his polished black Crown Victoria, because there are certain gritty, working-class neighborhoods where a dark, tinted window attorney's sedan draws far too much hostile attention. "What can I get started for you this morning, hun?" Sarah asked, her voice raspy, dry, and thick with sheer physical exhaustion. She checked the glass service window, where the short-order cook was scraping the grill, hesitated for 5 agonizing seconds, and then slowly slid across the torn vinyl seat into the booth directly opposite me. She sat right on the absolute front edge of the cushion, her muscles coiled tight and ready to bolt toward the kitchen door at the first sign of aggression. Sarah's lower lip trembled once. A sudden, heavy rush of hot tears flooded the corners of her eyes, overflowing her lower lids and running silently down her pale, exhausted cheeks. She slumped backward against the duct-taped vinyl booth cushion, the defensive, fighting tension completely draining out of her spine, like water escaping a broken dam. "I know every single detail of what they did to you, Sarah," I said quietly, squeezing her calloused hands. "I know about the staged hotel photographs. I know about the fabricated miscarriage on the staircase. I know about the systematic embezzlement of our corporate funds. And most importantly, I know that young Danny is the only true, legitimate, honorable blood heir to the Ford family name walking this earth." "I do not understand what I am reading, Harlan," Sarah stammered out, looking from the financial ledgers up to my face in absolute bewilderment. "What are all these commercial loan documents? Who is Nemesis Corporation?" "I am terrified, Harlan," she whispered out, her voice trembling like a leaf in the winter wind. "Preston threatened my life. He swore to my face that if I ever crossed his path again, he would ensure I never worked a single day across this entire state." Sarah stared at the check, then looked at the complex corporate default clauses inside the folder, and finally raised her eyes to look directly into mine. "My morning shift ends at 2 o'clock, Sarah said, looking right at me with cold, determined eyes. "Where do we start our fight?" I pushed through the revolving glass doors and stepped into the expansive, 2-story marble entrance lobby of Ford Logistics. "Mr. Ford," Sam rumbled in a deep, gravelly bass whisper that didn't carry past the turnstile glass. "Preston and the executive board issued a mandatory priority security memo with your photograph across every terminal console in this lobby 3 days ago. The specific written directives state that you are completely barred from entry and that I am to initiate an immediate 911 dispatch to the city police department to have you arrested in cuffs if you stepped foot inside this building." The electronic glass barriers retracted smoothly into the steel consoles, opening the wide path toward the private executive elevator banks. I placed both of my palms flat against the frosted glass double doors, pushed them wide open with a sharp, explosive burst of physical momentum, and stepped right into the center of the boardroom. Sam is completely occupied downstairs enforcing actual corporate security protocols. "Preston." I spoke out, my baritone voice filling every cubic inch of the boardroom with absolute, unshakable authority. "And this commercial divestment meeting is completely, terminally illegal under our corporate charter. Before a single one of you gentlemen sitting around this table raises your hand to authorize the sale of our primary assets," I announced clearly, projecting my voice across the room to halt their movements, "you might want to verify your basic mathematical equity calculations with my legal counsel." I looked directly across the table into the cold eyes of Mr. Sterling. Mr. Sterling slowly picked up his Mont Blanc fountain pen, capped it with a sharp, decisive click, and placed it neatly into his jacket pocket. Without uttering a single word to Preston, he picked up his thick, leather acquisition binder, stood up from his chair, and buttoned his London jacket. I didn't flinch, I didn't duck my head or raise my hands to protect my face. I stood perfectly erect at my end of the table, tracking the flight of the crystal with cold, unblinking eyes. "And Preston," I added coldly, making sure the 4 cowering crony board members heard every word, "make certain you instruct our maintenance department to repair and refinish that damaged mahogany wall paneling immediately. The entire cost of the restoration is coming directly out of your personal executive salary." Mounted directly on the wall beside the double doors was a brushed brass plaque engraved in elegant script. "Der Elias Thorne, MD Chief of Obstetrics and Gynecology." I cast my eyes around the spacious, pristine, completely empty consultation room, looking at the vacant patient chairs and the clean glass surfaces. Call the city police department right this second, I repeated calmly, gesturing toward his telephone with my open hand. In fact, I insist upon it. I would thoroughly enjoy having an immediate, detailed three-way conversation with the authorities. In this room specifically, the detectives assigned to the district attorney's financial crimes and medical fraud division. Because I am mathematically certain those federal investigators would be extraordinarily interested in reviewing the complete, unredacted banking ledgers of your private offshore financial accounts. Specifically, the numbered corporate shell account registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Escalapius Holdings that received a direct wire transfer deposit of exactly $50. 2 years ago, on the exact, precise calendar day, you signed the sworn judicial affidavit stating under oath that my daughter-in-law suffered a traumatic miscarriage due to blunt force physical assault. This financial ledger proves absolutely nothing in a court of law. Dr. Thorne yelled across the desk, slamming his fist onto the glass until his pen holder rattled. Wealthy private patients frequently utilize holding companies and offshore wire transfers to pay for confidential, high-security medical retainer fees and private obstetrical consultations. That $50,000 was a standard, documented executive medical consulting fee. That specific date and time was exactly 2 hours before Tiffany St. Clair supposedly suffered her dramatic, violent fall down the 16 carpeted steps of the grand staircase inside Ford Manor. She came straight from that highway accident, right into your private examining rooms. Didn't she, Dr. Thorne, the baby? I possess zero concern or regard for your professional clinical reputation, Dr. Thorne, I said coldly. Just as you possessed zero concern for my 40-year reputation or my physical survival when you signed your name to a perjured affidavit that threw a 70-year-old man into a 9-by-6-foot concrete cell to rot for 2 continuous years. But I do possess an absolute, unyielding concern for clearing my own family name and establishing the legal truth. Dr. Thorne raised his head, his face washed clean of all pretense, looking at me with dead, hollow eyes. 2 continuous years of my human existence, 730 agonizing days and nights locked away inside a concrete prison cell, stripped of my dignity, my business, and my family name. All of it orchestrated and executed over a ruptured ovarian cyst, an illicit motorcycle ride with a gym trainer, and a $50,000 bribe to a gambling-addicted physician. We will have our firm's senior notary public stamp and certify this confession document within the hour, Dr. Thorne, Garrett stated professionally, placing the confession carefully inside his leather briefcase right next to the traffic photograph. And we will personally deliver a certified copy directly to the Chief Prosecutor of the United States Attorney's Office by 3 o'clock this afternoon, along with our formal motion to vacate Mr. Ford's conviction. We captured the corrupt pawn on the chessboard, Garrett, I replied calmly, looking straight down Fifth Avenue toward the glittering lights of the museum district. Now tonight, we march right into their high society ballroom and take the king and queen off the board forever. Sitting right in the absolute center of the front row VIP tables, surrounded by the wives of our primary institutional investors, was Tiffany. And so tonight, standing before our entire financial community, I am profoundly proud and privileged to formally announce that Ford Logistics is officially entering a massive, historic new era of commercial expansion and unprecedented profitability. We have successfully restructured our corporate capital balance sheets. We have streamlined our operating costs. And we stand right here tonight, financially stronger, more liquid, and more resilient than at any point in our 50-year history. At that exact, precise second, across the city and across the international financial wires, 3 distinct, catastrophic legal and financial actions triggered simultaneously without human intervention. He looked down from the stage into the front VIP tables and watched in growing, confused alarm as Mr. Marcus Vance, the senior managing director of our primary commercial credit union, reached urgently into his breast pocket, pulled out his smartphone, unlocked the screen, and stared down at his display. Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated in your chairs. Preston shouted into the microphone, his voice cracking into high-pitched, hysterical agitation as his hands gripped the sides of the podium until his knuckles turned white. There is obviously some catastrophic technical glitch or automated routing error across the financial news servers. Our corporate balance sheets are entirely secure. We possess $12 million in clean working capital, deposited directly into our primary operating accounts just last Wednesday. I assure you, as Chief Executive Officer, there is zero commercial default across our credit lines. I didn't rush my entrance across the elevated podium. I walked with slow, measured, heavy, rhythmic steps across the polished wooden stage boards, the heels of my oxblood Oxford shoes delivering a solid martial thud. Thud, thud, that carried across the stage floor directly behind Preston's back. The chaotic roaring uproar across the grand ballroom died down instantly, replaced by a tense, electrified, suffocating silence. Every single commercial bank president, hedge fund manager, and municipal judge inside the building locked their eyes onto my face. They recognized what was transpiring right in front of their eyes. They were not simply witnessing a corporate financial reorganization. They were watching the absolute, brutal, public coronation of the true king returning from exile to execute the usurper on the stage. That news report completely failed to mention exactly who owns, funds, and controls Nemesis Corporation. Preston snapped completely right on the stage. It was Sam. Before Tiffany could even attempt to turn around and slip away through the front VIP chairs toward the side fire exits, two additional, 6-foot-tall uniformed corporate security officers stepped out from the side aisle, grasped both of her arms firmly by the elbows, and lifted her physically out of her chair in her emerald green silk dress. Sam turned Preston around by his torn lapels and began marching him forcefully off the stage toward the left wing loading dock doors. Preston thrashed and dragged his heels across the floorboards every single step of the way, turning his head back over his shoulder to scream his lungs out across the ballroom. I placed the heavy metal cylinder of the microphone securely back into its acrylic stand, turned my back on the 500 staring executives, without offering them a single backward glance, and walked with firm, measured steps directly off the right side of the stage toward the rear service corridors. And standing right inside the loading dock bay, completely blocking the outer alleyway doors with professional cameras and directional microphones raised high, were 12 veteran crime reporters and investigative photographers from the city's primary newspapers and television networks. She stepped 2 paces backward across the concrete floor, her eyes blazing with absolute, unmasked disgust and sheer loathing as she looked my son right up and down from his torn collar to his scuffed loafers. "You are not walking out of this loading dock tonight, Tiffany." My voice rang out across the concrete bay with sharp, absolute freezing command that stopped her physical movement, dead in her tracks 5 feet from the door. What did you just say across that microphone, Dad?" Preston whispered out into the silence, taking 2 stumbling steps forward across the concrete toward us, his face twisting with paralyzed confusion. "What do you mean she doesn't have a son with me?" Little Leo is 14 months old. He is my boy." Then he looked up from the page, his face completely drained of every drop of human blood, looking from the paper to Tiffany's frozen, chalky face across the bay. In this sworn judicial confession, which has already been delivered to the Chief Prosecutor of the United States Attorney's Office, I continued relentlessly across the microphones. Dr. Thorne explicitly details under oath how Mrs. Tiffany St. Clair Ford paid him an illicit $50,000 offshore wire transfer bribe 2 years ago to systematically fabricate her emergency medical triage records. He confirms under oath that Mrs. Ford was admitted to his clinic on the evening of May 14th, suffering from acute internal abdominal hemorrhaging caused by the spontaneous rupture of a benign 4-centimeter ovarian cyst, which ruptured internally when she suffered physical trauma riding on the back of a high-speed motorcycle on Interstate 95, with her personal fitness trainer 2 hours prior to her supposed fall down my staircase. The secondary forensic comparative analysis returned from Zurich at noon today, Preston. I said to my son, whose entire body was now swaying back and forth across the concrete as if he were suffering a major neurological stroke. Probability of biological paternity between the fitness trainer and your 14-month-old son, Leo, 99-98%. Tiffany didn't utter a single word of verbal defense across the room. She couldn't, with Thorne's sworn medical confession, the DNA paternity exclusion report, and the traffic surveillance photographs, resting right in my hands before 12 news cameras. Every single conceivable lie had been completely obliterated. Her prolonged, stony silence across the loading dock was the absolute, most damning judicial confession on earth. I looked down across the concrete floor at the broken, weeping ruin of my 38-year-old son, kneeling at my boots. I felt zero paternal softness in my chest. I felt zero urge to reach down my hand and lift him up from the dirt. Every single one of you gentlemen of the press possesses your complete, verified, front-page news story tonight. I announced clearly across their microphones, holding up Garrett Hale's briefcase containing our affidavits. You possess the sworn medical confession proving the false assault arrest, the DNA forensic paternity exclusion records, the commercial wire transfer bribery ledgers, and the corporate default decrees. I strongly encourage your editorial boards to print every single word, every single photograph, and every single financial document across the front pages of your morning editions. They knew the exact faces, the exact names, and the exact criminal statutes of every individual they were entering that loading dock to arrest tonight. Tiffany gasped out loud as the cold steel cut deep into the skin of her wrists. She threw her head back, her eyes wild and bloodshot under the video lights, and attempted desperately to twist her torso away from the two female detectives as they began guiding her toward the open alleyway doors. Preston didn't offer the slightest physical resistance or attempt to fight the officers. All the manic, arrogant bravado that had defined his executive career had completely evaporated out of his body. He hung his head weakly down between his shoulders, allowing the two financial detectives to reach under his armpits, lift his heavy 200-pound frame off the concrete floor onto his feet, and pull both of his arms firmly behind his back to snap the steel cuffs around his wrists. The two financial detectives tightened their grip around his biceps, attempting to force him forward toward the car, but with a sudden, desperate surge of hysterical physical strength, Preston twisted his torso partially free from the left officer's grasp and stumbled blindly 3 paces across the concrete platform right toward where I stood. I protected you from the harsh realities of this world for 40 continuous years of your life. Preston, I spoke out to him, my voice dropping into a low, lethal, granite-hard baritone whisper that carried with terrifying, crystal-clear precision across the directional microphones of the press. I gave you a magnificent, 20,000-square-foot home on the highest hill in this county. I gave you a top-tier university education paid in cash. I gave you a multi-billion-dollar corporate empire that I built with 50 years of my own sweat and blood. I taught you every single day of your youth right from wrong. I taught you that a man's spoken word and his written bond are the absolute inviolable measure of his moral worth on this earth. Let the concrete walls of Cell Block D teach you the true value of human freedom over the next 15 years of your life, I said coldly. Let the dead silence of the federal prison yard teach you the absolute value of truth over falsehood. Because as your father, my instruction is officially finished forever. Less than 10 seconds later, the 6 law enforcement vehicles inside the narrow service alleyway engaged their high-decibel sirens in unison. The tires spun on the wet asphalt, and the convoy of marked cruisers and dark blue federal sedans accelerated rapidly out of the alleyway, turning onto Fifth Avenue and speeding away into the dark city night, with their red and blue strobe lights flashing against the surrounding skyscrapers, carrying away inside their steel cages every single ounce of the toxic rot, entitlement, and betrayal that had infected my life for 2 years. 3 continuous weeks later, the bright, golden morning sun streamed brilliantly through the soaring, 40-foot floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the executive penthouse suite on the 42nd floor of Fifth Avenue. I had formally and publicly appointed Sarah as the permanent chief financial officer and executive vice president of Ford Logistics 14 days earlier during our emergency board reorganization. Sarah picked up the heavy leather trust binder, running her fingers gently over the gold-embossed title across the cover, a warm, radiant, genuine smile illuminating her entire face, a smile that reached all the way up into her eyes. A deep, profound, expanding wave of pure, restorative, golden warmth flooded right through the center of my chest, a warm, clean human emotion that possessed absolutely zero connection to $12 million offshore debt notes, corporate stock proxies, or high society charity galas. She paused for 2 agonizing seconds across the static. 2 continuous years ago, before I walked out of the prison gates, if that phone line had blinked across my desk, I would have lunged forward, across the blotter, and snatched the receiver off the cradle within 2 seconds. I would have felt my heart pounding with anxious, desperate, paternal concern. I would have instantly instructed Garrett Hale to dispatch 3 senior criminal partners to the penitentiary, with blank checkbooks to pay his bail, hire high-priced expert witnesses, manipulate the judicial evidence, and bury his mistakes completely out of the public eye to protect the family name. And then right across the center of that industrial prison cacophony came Preston's voice over my speakerphone. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair behind the desk, holding the silver receiver 6 inches from my face, allowing his desperate, pleading words to pour out over the speakerphone into the quiet room. The cafeteria food inside a state penitentiary is deliberately designed and manufactured to taste like industrial sludge. Preston, I spoke softly into the receiver, keeping my tone entirely conversational. It is a federal prison block, son, not the country club dining room on Old Hickory Lane. I ate that exact same gray sludge, off a plastic tray, every single morning, at 6 o'clock for 730 continuous days, while you sat on your balcony drinking 30-year-old scotch. Trust me from personal experience, after about the 4th continuous month inside cell block D, your palate adjusts completely, and you learn how to swallow every bite just to survive the winter. And when a physical limb attached to your own body becomes gangrenous, infected, and terminally rotted from the inside out, Preston, I said softly across the line, you do not keep that rotting limb attached to your torso out of blind biological sentimentality or family nostalgia simply because you were born with it. The blinking red LED indicator light next to line 4 extinguished instantly, dropping the console back into complete, permanent, unblinking blackness. I stood up slowly from my high-backed leather executive armchair. I walked around the edge of the mahogany desk, stepped across the thick carpeting, and stood directly right in front of the soaring, 40-foot floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking 5th Avenue and the sprawling, magnificent urban landscape of the city 100 feet below my boots. I reached down, took Sarah's right hand gently off the cover of the trust binder, and squeezed her fingers with broad, paternal warmth. This dramatic audio narrative leaves every single one of us facing a stark, profound, and urgently necessary psychological truth about human relationships. Toxic, manipulative, and parasitic behavior must absolutely never be tolerated, excused, or enabled, simply because the individual inflicting the abuse happens to carry the exact same biological last name or genetic markers across their birth certificate.